I've seen job postings where they're like needs to be native speaker, needs to be a native speaker to teach elsewhere. I think there are countries there that ask like you need to be at least a native speaker. Some Gulf countries and for Japan and Korea, I've seen that they, I might be wrong, but I've seen some countries saying we specifically want native English speakers from these countries, but it doesn't keep someone from South Africa or from Nigeria to teach as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's really true. I think, yeah, typically you see that in the Middle East and in Asia,
Hmm.
where it's kind of a tricky thing because there are pros and cons to being a native speaker. Native speakers typically have good pronunciation and there's some benefits, but non-native speakers or multi-competent language users, sometimes we use that term for teachers that are great teachers. Sometimes they come with better understanding of the language. So just because you're a native speaker doesn't mean you're a good teacher. And so it's kind of a myth that you really need a native speaker. In some cases, you have a non-native speaker or someone that learned the language as a second language learner that actually is a much better teacher. They understand the language better. They can relate to the students better because the students are on the same journey that they've been on, so they can help the students in a lot of ways. In some cases, you might have some benefits at the lower proficiency levels to actually have a non-native speaker teacher that really understands that journey. And then in some cases, as you get into higher proficiency levels, if you're really focused on aspects of pronunciation, there could be a benefit to having a native speaker. But I think it's great to have all kinds of English in your environment and different kinds of teachers because it helps you have a well-rounded experience in your learning.
And can you tell me what makes a good ESL teacher?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my thinking, the goal, the job of a language teacher is to promote or facilitate language development. And so there are a lot of things that teachers do and can do, but what will really make a difference to achieve that job, that goal, is facilitating activities where the language is being used in authentic ways. And when there's meaning present and the language is being used, it sticks in the brain a lot better. So if you're starting to learn vocabulary or syntactic structures and you start using those in real ways, it sticks. And so a really good language teacher isn't necessarily going to get up at the board and talk about how grammar works. They're going to, that's important. People need to learn vocabulary and they need to learn how syntax works in a language. But more importantly, perhaps, is the opportunities that they create to practice the language, to use the language in authentic ways. That's going to make a difference. When that's happening, language is developed. When that's not happening, there's a big difference between knowing about a language and being able to use the language. And so in some classes, you have a teacher gets up at the board and they talk about grammar or they talk about this is how the language works. And so the students begin to learn about the language. But that doesn't mean they can use the language. The teacher then needs to go into a mode where they're practicing, where they're using the language. And ideally, they'll do something that we would call psychologically authentic. So, you could go to the store and you could literally buy things at the store or interact with, the clerk at the store, and that would be real. You can also do things like that in the classroom where you're interacting with realia or things and you're actually having exchanges, interactions, questions and answers that are psychologically authentic, even if you're not really at the store. But those kinds of exchanges will help language develop. So it's much more important to do something with the language, to use the language, to practice the language, than to just learn about the language.